Are you worried about the birth rate? Are you concerned that young people are foregoing marriage for things like education, happiness, and jobs? Well, fear not, because the Heritage Foundation has come to the rescue. Yes, indeed, folks. The tradwife aesthetic flooding your social media is the soft focus branding arm of a hardline political project, one with legislative intent, economic leverage, and a whole lot of state power behind it. Behind the sourdough starters and linen aprons is a coordinated effort to fundamentally restructure the American family, not through persuasion, but through pressure. We're doing a deep dive analysis of the pivotal report from the Heritage Foundation titled Saving America by Saving the Family. While influencers romanticize a return to mid-century domesticity, this document is a policy blueprint which supplies the actual legal and economic architecture of that vision. We're going to break down how this report uses financial coercion to force marriage, why it seeks to dismantle modern childcare infrastructure, and the deeply revealing stance it takes on IVF and reproductive autonomy. By the end, it will be absolutely clear that the tradwife trend was never just about baking bread. It was always about conditioning the public for a future where women's participation in the workforce is quietly reframed, not as a right, but as a problem to be solved. Before we get started, you know what to do. Love or hate, like and share, because the algorithm does not care. Saving America by Saving the Family argues that the United States is facing a civilization crisis driven by declining marriage rates, falling birth rates, and the erosion of the two-parent household. The report claims that these trends threaten economic stability, social cohesion, and national survival. The central thesis is that the heterosexual, married, biological parent family is the foundational unit of civilization, and that public policy should actively enforce this structure. I wish for once they'd come up with something original. Republicans have been singing this sorry tune for 30 years, but here we go. While the authors repeatedly insist that government should play a limited role in Americans' lives, the report proposes an extensive re-engineering of tax, welfare, labor, childcare, and reproductive policy to incentivize marriage, discourage non-marital family structures, and reshape individual life choices through economic pressure. The policy report is built on several non-negotiable premises. Children have a right to be raised by their married, biological mother and father. Alternative family structures are framed as inherently inferior, both morally and socially. Adult autonomy is repeatedly subordinated to what the authors define as children's needs, and social decline is attributed not to structural inequality, labor precarity, or increased housing costs, but to cultural permissiveness around sex, marriage, and women's independence. Marriage is treated not as a private relationship, but as a pre-political institution the state is justified in protecting and privileging. They blame the decline in families on the usual suspects: welfare programs that allegedly make marriage economically irrational, the rise of single-parent households, delayed marriage and childbirth, women's labor force participation framed as a cost to family formation, cultural shifts including feminism, secularism, pornography, and careerism, whatever that is. What, having a job? And finally, childcare systems that enable dual-income households. Rather than treating these as outcomes of economic transformation, the report frames them as policy mistakes and moral failures that must be reversed. So here's how the good white Christian nationalist folks over at the Heritage Foundation plan to fix the family. I can't wait. The first pillar of the Heritage Report is what we can call the marriage coercion. The report argues that the breakdown of the nuclear family is the root of all evil, the root of American instability. But instead of suggesting social support, it proposes using the tax code and welfare system as a cudgel. The report proposes embedding marriage metrics into all economic policy, explicitly stating that the workforce and development program should aim to make men and women more marriageable. Key proposals include eliminating marriage penalties in welfare while adding stricter work requirements, conditioning benefits on marital status, expanding federally supported marriage education and relationship boot camps, whatever those are. Conservatives think that welfare penalizes marriage because many means-tested programs are built around household income and marital status. Because these social welfare systems were created before women could have their own bank accounts, before they had access to credit and education, and before they had the legal right to use birth control. This means that two low-income adults can actually end up worse off after marrying than they were when they were single. Benefits are calculated by combining incomes without proportionately increasing support. So the act of getting married can trigger sharp benefit losses even when nothing about the family's material reality has meaningfully improved. In that framework, marriage becomes financially risky for people who are already living at the margins. Nevertheless, conservatives don't treat this as a welfare policy design flaw. They treat it as a moral problem. Marriage is assumed to be a stabilizing institution and a pathway out of poverty. So welfare is framed as replacing what a husband is supposed to provide. When a single parent, usually a woman, can access housing, food, and healthcare, and those supports diminish once a partner enters the household, conservatives interpret that as the state rewarding single motherhood and discouraging marriage. The conclusion they draw is not that families need more support, but that the system itself is providing the wrong incentives. Underneath the technical argument is a much deeper belief about how society should be organized. The married two-parent household is treated as the natural and proper unit of social life, and public policy is expected to reinforce it. Welfare becomes suspect not just because it costs money, but because it allows women and children to survive outside of male breadwinner dependence. In that sense, welfare is framed as culturally corrosive. It weakens traditional gender roles, loosens the link between marriage and childbearing, and undermines what conservatives see as the moral architecture of family life. What the conservative narrative consistently leaves out is that the economic instability comes first. People don't avoid marriage because welfare makes them comfortable. They avoid it because low wages, precarious work, unaffordable housing, lack of health care, and non-existent childcare make marriage financially dangerous. Welfare benefits are modest and tightly restricted, and the steepest benefit cliffs often hit the people who are the least able to absorb them. The conservative narrative flips the cause and the effect, blaming family structure for poverty rather than acknowledging how economic conditions actually shape family choices. Once marriage has been framed as something the state has been unfairly penalizing, it becomes easy to justify reshaping social policy around coercion rather than care. Ending marriage penalties typically means tightening eligibility, adding more work requirements, and redirecting resources towards married couples rather than expanding support for everyone. The goal is not to reduce poverty, it's to use economic pressure to steer people towards a specific model of family life, whether or not that model reflects the realities that those people are actually living in. If you are poor, you must marry someone with a lot more money than you for that decision to make financial sense. There's only one thing that can fix poverty, and it's not marriage, it's money. Proposals to reward early marriage and increase childbearing include the Newlywed Early Starters Trust, or NEST accounts. The federal government makes a one-time deposit of $2,500 into savings accounts automatically created for every newborn child born within a first marriage, if the parents are under the age of 30. Notice, born during a first marriage. You don't get that credit if you're divorced. Interesting, huh? The Family and Marriage Tax Credit. This is a refundable tax benefit exclusively for married couples who have a child together. It provides $4,418 per year per child, paid to married joint filers who are the child's biological parents. The credit is available in the year the child is born and for the next 3 years. In total, the per-child benefit adds up to $17,670, but is deliberately spread out to reward marriage stability over time, they say. So you only get the benefit if you stay married. The design becomes more aggressive with larger families. Married couples having 3 or more children receive a 25% large family bonus, increasing the annual credit for those additional children to $5,521 each. Taken together, the FAM credit is not a neutral child benefit. It is a tightly conditioned financial incentive that ties significant cash support to marriage, biological parenthood, continued work, and family expansion. Marriage is framed as an economic milestone that the state should actively subsidize. The report suggests restructuring the tax code to provide massive marriage bonuses while simultaneously removing the safety nets that allow single parents, statistically mostly women, to survive independently. Of course, we know that the goal here isn't really to encourage marriage. It's to create an environment where, for the poor and working class, marriage becomes an economic survival strategy instead of a romantic choice. To return to a time when a woman's financial security was legally and practically tethered to a husband. We all know childcare in America is in a crisis. The cost of childcare in the U.S. for one child is between $13,000 and $15,000 per year. For infant care, that's closer to $17,000. The average cost of rent in the U.S., according to Zillow, is $1,995 a month. So if you are going to spend close to $24,000 in rent on average each year, childcare will represent anywhere from 54 to 70% of your rental costs. And these are conservative estimates. It's effectively similar to doubling your rent or mortgage payment. That's insane. But the Heritage Foundation's solution isn't to make childcare more affordable. Oh no, it's to eliminate it. The report explicitly targets federal funding for child care centers, arguing that they institutionalize children and detach them from the family. Instead, they want to give that money back in the form of small tax credits, but only to families that have a stay-at-home parent. Who do you think that stay-at-home parent is? By making professional childcare even more scarce and expensive, and only rewarding the single income model, the policy effectively forces women out of the workforce. It's the ultimate bait and switch. They acknowledge the childcare crisis, but then they use it as a tool to ensure that women return to the home, because the policy ensures that most women will have no other choice. This brings us to the part of the report that's the most telling. To anyone left who still doubts that this is conservative white Christian nationalist propaganda, this policy is the most obvious red flag. The report's stance on IVF and reproductive technology. This is where the saving the family narrative hits a massive contradiction. If the goal is to create more families, you would think that IVF would be celebrated, right? But instead, the report is critical of IVF, arguing that IVF does not meaningfully increase birth rates, that it leads to embryo destruction, that it encourages delayed childbearing, and that it commodifies children. So wait, IVF commodifies children, but referring to children as gifts from God doesn't commodify them? What about having kids just so you have someone to take care of you when you're old? No? Okay. The report aligns with the view that life begins at conception in a way that legally endangers the IVF process. Why? Because IVF allows for non-traditional family building. It allows women to delay childbirth for their careers, and it allows for family structures that don't fit the bioessentialist model, a man and a woman creating a biological child. Instead, the authors promote something called restorative reproductive medicine, which is focused on natural fertility and explicitly rejects what they call technocratic or dystopian solutions like artificial wombs. This is very Maha, make America healthy again. This kind of non-science-based BS. By the way, the only people I hear talking about artificial wombs are men when they're trying to threaten women into settling for some dusty who refuses to wash his ass and doesn't own a bed frame. By attacking IVF, the policy aims to control how and when families are made. They claim they're trying to save the family while simultaneously stripping away the tools that modern families use to actually exist. This policy position proves that this is not about having more babies. It's about having babies within a specific kind of family structure. By the way, the policy is completely counterintuitive to raising the birth rate because older women are the only women that are having more babies. The birth rate decline has largely been driven by women under the age of 30 having fewer children. Children born to teenage girls and 20-something women were the bread and butter of the American birth rate. They are the demographic of women whose birth rate has declined the most. In 1990, teen pregnancy accounted for 13% of all births. In 2023, it only made up 4%. During that time period, the fertility rate for women ages 35 to 39 increased by 71%, and for women ages 40 to 44, it increased by 127%. So if your goal is to increase the birth rate, why would you remove access to the reproductive technology used by the only demographic of women whose birth rates are actually rising? Because raising the birth rate is not the primary goal. Those older women still got to go to college. They still got to have jobs. They still got to have careers. They have economic autonomy. And that is what the Heritage Foundation is really targeting. It's not about getting more women to have babies. It's about coercing women into having babies earlier by removing their options, which also limits their educational opportunities and earning capacity, forcing them to increasingly rely financially on men, which makes them easier to control. The report leans heavily on bioessentialism. This is the idea that men and women have fixed innate roles that are biologically determined. Men and women, they say, bring unique and complementary assets to the vocation of parenthood. By the way, when you see the word vocation used in a policy paper, that's a big red flag. That word is used heavily in white Christian nationalist culture. It means a divine calling, how God calls you to serve him in the world. It has a deeply religious connotation. I've talked about benevolent sexism on my channel. Saving America by Saving the Family is a textbook example of it. This is the kind of sexism that insists that it loves women, values mothers, and wants to support families, while quietly stripping women of autonomy and narrowing the range of lives that are deemed legitimate. It doesn't attack women directly. It praises them, and that praise is precisely how the control is justified. The report frames women primarily as mothers, caregivers, and moral anchors of the household. It speaks the language of protection and support, reducing the burdens of child rearing, honoring the sacrifice, restoring dignity to the home, but only within a very specific arrangement: heterosexual marriage, biological parenthood, and gendered labor roles. And the women are only valued so long as they perform those roles correctly. Their labor in the home is romanticized, subsidized, and elevated rhetorically, while their participation in the workforce is treated as a social problem to be managed rather than a right to be protected. The report does not argue that women are inferior. It argues that women are special. Anytime you hear language saying women are special, that should be a red flag too. It casts motherhood as women's highest calling and presents state intervention as the way to free women from economic pressure by making dependence on marriage more financially attractive and independence more precarious. Policies like FAM and HCE credits are framed as giving women choices, but those choices are carefully engineered. Support is conditioned on marriage, biological parenthood, and work thresholds, while alternative arrangements like single parenthood, cohabitation, and delayed marriage, child-free adulthood are quietly penalized or excluded. The report repeatedly claims to respect Americans' freedom and agency, yet its policy logic depends on steering behavior through economic pressure. That contradiction is central to benevolent sexism. Women are said to be free, but only free to choose what the state has already decided is best for them. If a woman wants children outside of marriage, she's irresponsible. If she prioritizes career stability before motherhood, she's delaying what she owes to society. If she relies on childcare to remain employed, the policy framework treats this as a distortion in need of correction. In that sense, her choices are acceptable only when they align with the preferred moral outcome. The report never explicitly says women should be forced back into the home. Instead, it builds a system where staying home is rewarded, leaving the home is punished, and dependency on a man is reframed as a virtue. It uses the language of care to mask the reality of constraint. Women are not coerced through bans or mandates, but through incentives that quietly redraw the boundaries of acceptable life paths. In the end, Saving America by Saving the Family treats women like instruments of social stability. Their autonomy is secondary to demographic goals. Their labor is valued only when performed for free inside the home, and their freedom is something to be managed in service of a larger moral project. That is benevolent sexism in its purest form. Not hatred, not hostility, but a soft, smiling insistence that women will be happiest, safest, and most fulfilled when someone else decides what their lives are for. Saving America by Saving the Family imagines an America where economic pressure does the dirty work that outright bans cannot. Childcare is quietly gutted, reproductive technology is tightly constrained, and the tax code is rewired so that women's choices all point in the same direction: out of the public sphere and back into the kitchen. This is a deliberate strategy, a redesign of the economy, the welfare system, and family law meant to make female autonomy so expensive and so inconvenient that submission starts to look like common sense. Thanks for watching. See you next time. If you enjoy this kind of content, I invite you to watch my series, Witches, Whores, and Rebels, a feminist history of patriarchal capitalism and how to burn it down. It's a 3-part series with a 90-page companion guide that gives you the history of how we got here, centering the witch hunts, women's resistance, and providing a framework for how we move forward from here. The link is in the description when you're ready.